Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Walter Kalin. I'm the envoy of the chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, the chair presently being the EU. And it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you here. We have an hour, so I won't make a long introductory speech. But when you're looking at the topic of this event here, Averting, Minimizing and Addressing Disaster Displacement Partnership and Integrated Approaches for Action and Support, that's terribly general. And I don't think that we will cover everything. But we can build on what was said this morning during the opening session. Those of you who were there, it was basically three key messages. We need more money and a broader donor base. We need, because we never will get all that money, to invest more into anticipatory action, into preparedness, and we need, third message, to really invest into the nexus, working across silos together. We won't talk a lot about money in the next 60 minutes, but we'll talk about anticipatory action, about preparedness, and we'll talk on how to bring together humanitarian action with climate action, with disaster risk reduction. So I think it will be really exciting. Exciting because we have all these great panelists here. I'll introduce them in the interest of time, one after another. Let us, however, start with some welcome remarks by the EU as chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement. My great pleasure to welcome Ms. Joanna Darmanin, who is the head of the Humanitarian Aid Thematic Policies Unit at ECHO. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you. Does it work?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, without pushing buttons. So welcome to all of you here today. It's hard to bring an audience in from after lunch, so hopefully under the guidance of Professor Galen will make inroads. But also for those of you who have joined us online, the organization of this talk very much speaks to the value added of having the PDD and for the Secretariat. So our thanks goes to them for convening us around this forum. I think, as Professor said, we all heard the opening remarks today about the situation we are in, the sharply increasing humanitarian needs with the response which doesn't keep a pace. And on top of that, the issue of climate, which is likely to make and see the needs go further up and increase dramatically. I think also today we heard in HRVP Borrell's speech just some recent events, so the cataclysmic floods in Pakistan, the prolonged drought in the Horn of Africa, and the earthquake in Turkey are all examples of how the climate is going to climb further and further up on our agenda. Displacement that this brings is certainly also something that is dramatic. People face huge risks, not only in terms of the immediate needs that they have, but also in terms of access to adequate protection, basic social services, and also the search for durable solutions, which I think is on all of our agendas, and certainly something we need to focus on. It's clear that all these multiple complex issues will need to be monitored very closely, and we have stepped up our efforts in this area over the past years. I think having this discussion here today during this forum, but also there was the first discussion also last year, is something about bringing together all the different stakeholders around this issue, because it is complex. And if we are to try and find our solutions, then we're going to have to do this together. So thank you very much for the BTD for using their convening power time and again to bring us all together. As Professor Kalin mentioned, The EU is the chair of the PDD as of July last year, and this will end in December. So events such as this are certainly critical milestones for us. We're glad to have been supported also and build on the achievements of Fiji. And I acknowledge the presence here of Ambassador, who certainly led the process for the previous 2 years. So chapeau for that and for all the work you've done on this. And also to acknowledge the efforts of our Vice Chair, Kenya, who has taken us along the first months of our mandate over the past 6 months. A couple of issues of our main priorities as chair of the PDD, certainly the need for strengthened coordination in order to deal with this issue and to better respond to disaster and climate-related displacement, and that means clearly a focus on research and data collection as well as the analysis that backs all of this up. The need to support capacity and policy developments in this area, and these were some of the issues that were part of the staff working document that the Commission released last summer before we took over the chairmanship of the PDD. But I think, as Professor Kalin also mentioned, the issue of the nexus, it was also something that was discussed in the opening session. We need to be better at improving the link between humanitarian and development efforts at multilateral and intergovernmental levels in order to focus more on the resilience of communities. And for example, our staff working document was not just the humanitarian side, but we work in close cooperation, for example, with DG INTPA, both in terms of the development of the policy, but also on the ground when it comes to responses. Another important aspect of the work of the chair of the PDD is the issue of advocacy and dialogue. And indeed, I think, as Professor Kalin mentioned, the process that came out of COP27 last year gives us a unique opportunity to redouble our efforts in this regard. Finally, one of the remaining priorities for the EU in terms of our chairmanship is the issue to look at the institutional future of the PDD and trying to enhance its unique mandate. And this would mean also leading a joint reflection exercise on, for example, the institutional setting, but also the functioning modalities and objectives which will feed into the strategic review process of the PDD. I think I'll stop there and hand over to you, Professor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joanne. Thank you so much for providing us with key information on PDD and its activities. But you already started to really talk about the nexus here. It's the internal nexus, which in many, many institutions is already a big challenge. But we can see how DG INPA, ECHO, also climate are working together in supporting our activities. Very generous support, which we very much appreciate. Let's move into our topic of disaster displacement in the context of disasters, adverse effects of climate change. And we would like to start with simply providing some information on data trends on disaster displacement. And I'm inviting Christelle Gazaba, the head of programs at the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center in Geneva, to make her presentation. She's not here, but she will show up in a minute on this wall. So let's see whether the link now works.
I'm showing up on the wall, am I? Good afternoon, everybody.
Not yet, we hear your voice.
You can hear
now,
me, that's good.
Here you are, welcome.
Excellent, thank you very much, Professor. Very sorry to be joining you only remotely today. I apologize, I hope it was not too complicated to get me on the screen. And it is a pleasure to be here, sort of, and to hear the conversations that you will have in the room. I also do have a presentation, so I'm going to try and share it. I hope that works. Otherwise, we will do without, but it would certainly help. Can you see this?
Yes, it works well. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. So as you already introduced, Professor, I'm here to really just set the stage with a few pieces of information about the scale of disaster displacement around the world and the risk of future displacement in the context of climate change. We are actually releasing our new estimates very soon. That is why I cannot be there with you today. But because they are not yet ready to be released and they will be published on the 11th of May, throughout this presentation, I will be referring to our latest available data, which is as of December 2021. Let me start by putting things in perspective. For many years, when we spoke about internal displacement, we were really only referring to people forced to leave their homes because of conflict or violence. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center only started reporting information on people displaced by disaster in 2008. And as you can see with this graph, hopefully, yes, we were right to do so. Year after year, disasters lead to many more internal displacements than conflicts and violence. Almost 24 million in 2021, more than 1.5 times the number for conflicts and violence. Many of these disaster displacements are short-term, and some are even life-saving. Our estimates include millions of preemptive evacuations, after which evacuees are able to return home. But millions of others are not. Their houses are damaged or destroyed, their resources lost, their livelihoods affected. This map shows the global distribution of people who were living in internal displacement as a result of disasters at the end of 2021. As you can see, the whole world is affected, with results in virtually every country. Asia and the Pacific is the region most affected. They accounted for 3/4 of the global total over the past decade. The main drivers of disaster displacement, here in blue, are weather-related. Storms, including cyclones, accounted for 11.5 million internal displacements in 2021, closely followed by floods with around 10 million. Geophysical hazards like earthquakes and volcanic eruptions led to 1.4 million internal displacements. There is a common misconception that disaster displacement and climate change-related displacements are the same. But as you can already tell, that is not true. First, disaster displacements linked with geophysical hazards have not much to do with climate change. And even within weather-related displacements, we actually do not have enough data to say how many are the results of climate change and how many are the results of disasters that would have happened anyways. Our data also does not account for other triggers of displacement linked with climate change, such as loss of livelihoods, loss of territory, or food and water insecurity. This part of the phenomenon is simply invisible for the moment. Without better information, it can be difficult to anticipate climate-related displacement and prepare adequately. But some information is available to help guide investments. The data we have collectively been collecting for some years now is useful in identifying the risk landscape. We know which regions, which countries, which parts of these countries are usually most affected by floods, storms, droughts that have led to displacement in the past and will likely do so again if no action is taken. And that is the note I would like to end on. Action can be taken. Disaster displacement can be prevented or at least mitigated in many cases. Disasters are not natural, we say, and displacement is not inevitable. By investing now in disaster risk reduction, climate change mitigation and adaptation, education, and alternative livelihoods that would allow people to stay when their environment changes, we can influence the likelihood and the scale of future disaster displacement. Currently, our global disaster displacement risk model estimates that on any given year, an average of 14 million people will be displaced worldwide by storms, floods, earthquakes, and tsunamis. But this does not yet take into account the effects of climate change. Before the end of the year, we will release a new disaster displacement risk model that will incorporate climate change scenarios and provide a more accurate estimation of future disaster displacement. Our initial results from a couple of countries have shown already that the risk of flood-related displacement could double with an optimistic climate change scenario and triple with a pessimistic one. The only sustainable course of action is therefore to invest now in averting, minimizing, and addressing disaster displacement. With this in mind, I very much look forward to hearing our different panelists present the initiatives they are contributing to. Thank you very much for your attention. And back to you, Professor.
Thank you so much, Christelle. In a short presentation, you really provided a very comprehensive picture of these challenges, not only the big numbers, but you also mentioned the multi-causality, which leads us to the topic of nexus when we're looking at responses. And very important what you said at the end, we can do something about it to some extent to mitigate, to avert and to mitigate. At PDD, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, we are conceptualizing disaster displacement by saying people really have to flee, have to run when they are exposed to a natural hazard and too vulnerable, not resilient enough to withstand its impacts. And this provides us with a lot of entry points for policy. We can try to reduce the hazard, at least when it's climate related. That's still the important message of the Paris Agreement, reduce the emission of greenhouse gases. We can invest into reducing exposure by helping people to move out of harm's way. This would be about planned relocation. This would be about migration as a way to cope with, to adapt migration pathways, one of the big topics of the Global Compact on Migration. But we also can try to help people to stay. And this is about climate change adaptation, and that's about disaster risk reduction. And this brings me to our next panelist, Mr. Nicolas Bishop, Disaster Risk Reduction Program Officer at IOM. And I have a first question to you, specific one. Right now we are talking a lot, and when I say we, then it's the Secretary General, then it's many key DRR stakeholders and actors that we need to invest more into early warning systems, into anticipatory action. And the question is, how exactly do you see the role of early warning in relation to preparing? Because we know very often we have warnings, but then what is going to happen with it?
Thanks, Professor Kalin. Can I just ask in the audience, is anyone here over 190 centimeters tall? For Americans and Brits, that's 6 foot. So for some countries in the world, including the Republic of Marshall Islands, you are the top of your head is the highest point of land in that island country. So in terms of the urgency that we're talking about here, increasing frequency of natural hazards, tropical storms, climate change induced impacts, the urgency is real, and it's affecting many countries where my organization, the International Organization for Migration, implements programming. To Professor Kalin's point on early warnings and early warnings for all, IOM is actively participating in all 4 pillars of the Early Warnings for All initiative, which seeks to provide universal coverage for everyone on Earth to 2027. Recently, over the last week, the emergency emergency event database of the Catholic University of Leuven recently released their latest report on figures this year. So building on top of what Christelle just told us, there were approximately 387 disaster events last year. They caused more than 30,000 deaths, which is a tripling over the 2021 figure. 185 million people affected globally, and at a cost of about $223 billion. Those are just economic losses. They don't account for things like disaster displacement. So non-economic losses often go unrecorded. When it comes to early warnings for all, what we're really talking about here is the prevention agenda. And last year, there was approximately $30 billion of overseas development assistance provided to DRR sectors. Unfortunately, 85% of that total went to emergency response. Only 12% went to multi-sectoral preparedness efforts, and only 3% went to early recovery. So in terms of things like building back better, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about, and sort of laying the groundwork to prevent disaster impacts down the road, we really are not there yet. So to some of the points raised by speakers earlier today, it is, yes, about diversification of the donor base, but I think it's also about attempting to find innovative and cost-effective solutions. For IOM, we do a lot of work around diaspora engagement, working on remittances. We have some very interesting programming in Somalia and in other humanitarian crisis contexts, working on things like matching grants for community support projects, communities that are very much dealing with the impacts of climate change directly, but require some level of assistance. So IOM will put forward 1/3 of the cost of a project, like a borehole. Then the community themselves will put forward some level of investment. And finally, a diaspora group will finalize that investment and the project comes to fruition. There is something called SOCAB, SOKAAB.org, where you can find matching grants programming there. It's a very innovative tool and really speaks to community level engagement. So getting back to the point about averting, minimizing, and addressing disaster displacement, early warnings, if you like, is really about bringing together national level forecasting and trying to ensure last mile delivery at the community level to make sure that communities can be responsive in the face of increasing disasters, climate change, and other drivers of human mobility from our perspective. So early warning for all is really, I think, the initiative of the moment for many stakeholders in this room and for our organization specifically, and really trying to work with a range of different regional and subnational bodies towards ensuring that communities are receiving early warnings and can act upon them to avoid loss of life and damage to people's livelihoods and properties. Thank you.
Thank you so much, in particular to giving real content to that abstract notion of early warning. And you already kind of alluded to the challenge that we're talking about so many aspects, disaster risk reduction, humanitarian action, climate action, and all of this has to be brought together. I know that ILO and others are working a lot these days on comprehensive risk management. Can you say a few words about what it means and again, how to do it in practice?
Sure, thank you. So for anyone in the room that's not familiar with comprehensive risk management, what we're really talking about is trying to synergize between disaster risk reduction concepts and climate change. It's often the case that when we talk about risk, at least traditionally, it doesn't always include climate-related hazards. And so when we talk about risk, we're really looking at a constellation where if you don't include risk into things like urban planning, as is very much the case, unfortunately, in the context of the Turkey-Syria earthquake, which happened in early February, you actually create new risks and forms of maladaptation that can easily result in mass loss of life and significant losses and damages in terms of economic losses, buildings damaged and destroyed, etc. So, as was the case in Turkey, it's not the earthquake as a hazard event that killed more than 50,000 people, but rather the fact that building codes had not been enforced. There were 18 amnesties since the building codes were revised in 1999 after the Izmit earthquake, when 17,000 persons unfortunately lost their lives at that time. So when we talk about comprehensive risk management, we're really looking at, basically under Target E of the Sendai framework, we're looking at elevating the number of countries that have disaster risk management strategies and making sure that they account for climate change in all of its examples at different countries around the world. So really, proper risk reduction requires climate information. And so there is now an effort led by UNDRR, the World Meteorological Organization, and UNDP to launch a new second generation disaster loss accounting system. A prototype will be presented in early May. And basically what IOM is seeking to do within this space, and this is something that I'd like to flag after Christelle's presentation, we're working together with IDMC on the development and piloting of a set of disaster displacement indicators. Ultimately, the target here is to empower states to report, collect, and analyze the impact of disaster displacements. Pilots are now ongoing in Mozambique, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and the Philippines. We're hoping to provide initial analysis in June, but essentially this will allow states to better understand the risks that are inherent with disaster displacement, report into disaster loss accounting systems, and this will eventually link to new climate financing mechanisms, including on loss and damage, which will be developed throughout the course of this year.
Thanks. I assume that at the end we'll have a little bit of time for questions, but let's group it together and continue with the presentations. Our next panelist is Ms. Kara Devonna Siahan, the head of the Anticipation Hub in Berlin, and even more importantly, former staff of the PDD when it was called the Nansen Initiative. So thank you so much, Kara. You're working on anticipatory action and financing within the humanitarian sector. And I would like to hear a little bit from you. What does it mean in practice? Can you tell us about some examples so we can better understand how this anticipatory financing and action approach works?
Thank you, Walter, and thank you to PDD for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to talk about two important topics that's near and dear to me, displacement and anticipatory action. I'll follow Nick's lead, actually, and ask the audience, who here know from on top of your head how much of crisis can be predicted? Half. Thomas, exactly, Thomas. That's correct. 50% of crisis can be predicted. How much of humanitarian financing is actually going for anticipatory action? Even less, Maria, less than 1%. So what is anticipatory action about? Again, we are now dealing with a world with, of course, increasing humanitarian needs, yet the science is saying that crises can be better predicted now. We have the science, we have the forecasting. So what does anticipatory action does? Anticipatory action basically is about three things. The first is the objective of anticipatory action is to mitigate or prevent the risk of predicted impacts of certain hazard. Number two, how do we do it? It should be done by a forecast or prediction, predictive analytics, collaboratively. And the third, that it has to happen ahead of the hazard impact, because a lot of people are saying, we have been doing early warning for decades now, and they are leading to action. But many studies have seen that most of the actions are to respond to disaster and not so much to anticipate and reduce disaster risk. And two elements that are important that are even more novel for anticipatory action is in previous time, you have the funding, the assessment after the impact is happening. For anticipatory action, to happen, basically those financing is already pre-agreed. There are mechanisms such as the UN Central Emergency Response Fund, the IFRC Disaster Relief Emergency Fund, the START Network Anticipation Fund. So these are funding mechanisms that can cater to having that predictability based on trigger, whether you are working on floods and drought. And the other one is actually to have this pre-agreed plans. This is important because if we knew the impact, if you know the impact of a flood to a certain community, why can't you design the activities that could really address those predicted impact as opposed to deciding on it later and making that funding predictable to actually pay or finance the activities that has to do with those impact by sector, whether it's on shelter, on health. So those are the elements really of anticipatory action. Now, when we talk about example, how does anticipatory action relate to disaster displacement? The first thing is around risk analysis. For anticipatory action, again, we define trigger based on the combination of risk, exposure, forecast, so we know when to act, where to act, and who is most at risk. I give the example of Bangladesh for a cyclone. The trigger is developed based on the understanding of if housing structure in the community can cause destruction more than 25% of the population there, then it would be prioritized. The activities of anticipatory action would be prioritized to this community. The second is on protecting people against arbitrary displacement. So we look at the cases of, again, coming to Bangladesh, that based on flood forecasts, 5 days flood forecast, they were able to anticipate and distribute cash, again, ahead of the flood peak. And this cash can be used to avoid people getting into a loan with high interest, making sure that they have the food that they need, again, securing nutrition. In Mongolia, in the case of Zoot, severe winter, people were able to protect their households 30 days in advance of a basically severe Zoot. So these are the types of anticipatory action that can address displacement. And of course, when it comes to response to displacement, by having those understanding of who is most impacted, how are they impacted, and what activities can actually be done to support them. We now have, for example, a group on protection, gender, and inclusion that that looks at how it is affecting women, children, and what type of activities. So again, right now, anticipatory action is being implemented in 60. We're actually working on a report that is to be launched next month, so stay tuned. 61 countries and 93 frameworks are currently being developed and ready, and some of them are ready to be activated in case a forecast is triggered. So those are where we are. A lot of progress on anticipatory action, Professor Kalin.
Thank you so much. Your two figures, 50% predictable, 1% investment. That's really something going wrong. And the question I have, next question is, what are the obstacles to scale up? Of course, I was very, very impressed this morning to hear State Minister Lindner announcing that Germany now will invest 5% of their humanitarian funding into anticipatory action. That's the right approach, but what are the obstacles? Is it lack of political will? Is it the systems?
Okay, maybe if I may talk about the obstacles from our ask. So in 2020, 2019, a group of agencies that is what we call the Anticipatory Action Task Force, consisting of IFRC, of course, working with National Red Cross, Red Crescent societies all over the world, FAO, WFP, OCHA, and the START Network, came up with this policy ask that has informed several different processes, such as the EU Council, COHAFA, such as the G7. We also provided the brief. So it's quite anchored around several things. So first, that right now anticipatory action is still being used mostly for hydrometeorological hazards. So in the 61 countries, it's mostly used for drought and flood. So we need to become better at using anticipatory action for more types of hazards, such as health as well, and also in different contexts. So if you go to the next session now, we are going to talk about anticipatory action in the context of conflict. Number two is, of course, the funding itself, Professor Kalin. Right now, that 1% is already very little, but if we think about anticipatory action doesn't only start when we distribute the cash. Anticipatory action starts again from early warning, from having institutional capacity to act, having that risk analysis. So I think coming back again to the question of Nexus, it is a shared responsibility. Right now, of course, we see the bulk of the implementation being done by humanitarian actors, but there's also a lot of exciting initiatives. You just mentioned, Nick, the Early Warning for All initiative, and we need to ask really donors to have this comprehensive look at programming and financing. If you are investing for infrastructures and institutions hundreds of millions of dollars, make sure that those investments also lead to, as early as possible, anticipatory action in the last mile. And sometimes these programming and financing can be quite fragmented. In the anticipatory action community, we like to talk about the build money and the fuel money. So it needs to be complemented. We need to look at it more comprehensively. And the second is our policy ask also looked at, again, the recognition that great progress is being made in the development sector, but we will not fully scale unless national governments are working on anticipatory action, providing the legal frameworks and implementing anticipatory action. We've seen good examples such as the ASEAN framework for anticipatory action, that's one, and we look at also even at the sub-national level, provinces in the Philippines actually putting budgets within their provincial, let's say, disaster management budget to be able to be triggered by anticipatory action. So we see promising results, but in order for anticipatory action to scale, we need to make sure that they are part of the national disaster risk management and climate change adaptation plan.
So we are back to comprehensive risk management in
Absolutely.
a way, not a long-term perspective. DRR often has the more short-term perspective, and it's about integrating this perspective into the systems, into the whole preparedness. Thank you so much. Of course, all of that does not mean that if you're successful, nobody has to move. People have to move. It is a reality, it will remain a reality. And this is bringing us to the next topic. Ms. Kathleen Mais, Director Human Mobility Hub, North Africa of the Norwegian Refugee Council, is working on people on the move. And I would be really interested to hear from you. And I learned that you're based in Tunisia, that you cover North Africa. What are the dynamics of these people on the move in the region you're working with? And what are the key protection concerns? And how does this relate to disasters, climate change impacts?
Okay, so maybe I can continue the tradition of community participation and ask all of you, how many people displaced by conflicts also came from climate change hotspots? Percentage? 75. One last try. 95%. So that really shows that it touches all of us, as Christelle already said, but that it touches people, that there's an awful amount of people who are on the move or could be at risk of displacement, and often in complex contexts. So the most vulnerable places for climate change, including Yemen, DRC, Somalia, are also large-scale humanitarian crises, which means that the institutions, the governments are not very well equipped to dealing with climate change disasters on top of humanitarian issues. And actually it's something we see at work day in, day out, including in Tunisia. What we now see is almost entire villages of young Tunisians moving to the coastal areas because agriculture is no longer possible. They don't find the opportunities, but at the same time, North Africa is also a transit and destination country for many people who fled conflicts, who fled for a variety of reasons and find themselves competing all in the same areas for jobs, for homes, for education, for access to services. And as we have seen recently now in Tunisia, this also leads to competition, to increased conflict and tensions in general. So what can we do about this? One thing is think about it. Start with including displacement considerations from the beginning, from early warning, awareness, to preparedness, as we also do, for example, the cash example was given, but also with documentation, and in the response, not only short term, but also in the longer term, till people find their feet again. And not only consider displacement in national disaster plans, in activities, but also include the people who have already been displaced, who are no longer in their place of origin, who are no longer at home. Make sure they get the early warning messages. They also get that cash. They also get included in responses, can move, for example, across borders again if needed, and have the solutions to build a future, whether it's in location number 1, 2, 3, or back at home. So I think this is something to consider. But also, lastly, I think we need to use disaster risk reduction as potentially an entry point, because not all countries find it easy to discuss displacement, but would find it more easy to discuss disasters, climate change. So there we can turn the world upside down.
Thanks. A second question, not directly following up, but building on your own experience. Certainly today and tomorrow, one other buzzword will be localization. And localization is looked at from different perspectives. As the big organizations from the north, the relationship with local actors being problematic. It's looked at sometimes from a more financial perspective. They can deliver more cheaply, more efficiently. There are many motives, and at the same time, we don't see that much of real localization. So what is your experience there? And I know you are working through local organizations.
So locally led initiatives and locally led responses, even at very low neighborhood community base, is extremely important. For example, we are engaging with youth in Tunisia and Egypt, quite far out of our normal humanitarian comfort zone, looking at engagement on green energy transitions. What are their suggestions of making those areas they're currently leaving more livable? Are there alternatives to leaving the area and taking potentially more dangerous routes? So that's probably answer number 1. Get out of that humanitarian bubble. Engage a lot more with environment actors, climate actors, a wide variety of groups who are there, have been there for often quite a long time, and are motivated, especially looking at youth groups. The obvious other ones are obviously looking at local knowledge, adapted solutions, but something we often forget is that not only are local partners frontline responders, they often respond to places where none of us are because we're simply too big and we don't know about it. So that is something to keep in mind. But at the same time, I think the buzzword was partnership, capacity building. So we really also do need to make sure they have the capacity to integrate protection concerns, to integrate displacement concerns better, and also be in an equal partnership, because often they're much better placed to raise principled, difficult points with local authorities than we are, and know better how to do this. Then we've been speaking a lot about financing, and I know this is not the topic of this discussion, but one important limitation of humanitarian actors is that humanitarian funding is time limited. It needs to come in fast, it needs to go out fast, which should not be the same with climate financing and local partners. They can work on much longer timelines, can do more sustainable and durable interventions, linking better to the nexus. But there are a few things that we can learn from the humanitarian system, and things that the humanitarian actors are still struggling with, but building in exactly this rapid response mechanism into climate financing and accessibility of funding. Not only a percentage that should go to local actors, but making sure the money is not very burdensome to obtain, that the processes are streamlined and clear from the beginning, acknowledging that there is no one size fits all, so making this part and parcel of all the discussions, for example, on the loss and damage fund. And finally, making sure that the money does go to the most vulnerable and not only large institutions, governments, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a fantastic panel, not only because of what they said, but also in terms of timekeeping. I've never experienced that. Thank you so much for that. And we really have time, I think about 10 minutes, for questions, for comments. Who would like to start? Atle, I already see you being ready.
No, I just want to make sure there was a microphone.
Okay, yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your contribution. Extremely interesting, as usual. Very quick question. We talk about anticipation, and I often do not hear what are the main thoughts around dissemination systems. Can I have one of your perspective on how important are dissemination systems within the early action strategies? What are your thoughts? Thank you very much.
Kara?
Short answer, very, very important. I think for us, of course, now, as I mentioned, anticipatory action builds on good disaster preparedness, DRR programming that organizations have built. And I think there has a lot of development, for example, into alerting and warning. For example, WMO and I4C is working on this alert hub, the use of better common alerting protocol. So what we are trying to encourage, so for those of you who are less familiar with the Anticipation Hub, it's a platform to facilitate learning, guidance, advocacy, and exchange on anticipatory action. We are German Red Cross, I4C, and the Climate Center, Red Cross Climate Center, but we have 100 partners across the different sectors, Red Cross, UN, governments, etc. And what we are trying to encourage as a community is to actually mix that more household capacity with these also big national or even regional instruments. Because if we can, for example, use better impact forecasting, if we know how people will be affected on what type of activity they do, and we combine them with alerting, and so again, switching between just alerting for people to prepare for response, but actually taking action. We always know most of the time these, the UN call it anticipatory action framework, the Red Cross calls it early action protocols. It's the same thing. It consists of the elements that I mentioned earlier. It's always not enough, but if there are also capacities within households to actually act based on those predicted impact using warning messages, that would be really the ideal situation. So how can we mix that science and capacity at the national level and organization with also households being able to know what to do ahead of the predicted impact?
Maybe just to also add that under Pillar 3 of the Early Warnings for All initiative, we're working with the International Telecommunications Union. I think it's important to reflect on the fact that 95% of the world is now covered by mobile phone networks. So there's a lot that can be achieved through mobile phone technology to disseminate messages. But at the same time, 5% of the world's population doesn't have access to that technology. So there are gaps in technology, and that's where the importance of last mile delivery really comes in. I think there's a lot in the aftermath of COVID-19 that we can learn from health systems in terms of community event-based surveillance. Many of the organizations represented in the audience today have a lot of work that they're doing on primary data collection, including my own organization. So we are actively collecting primary data on displacement in over 100 contexts with 8,000 primary data collectors and over 300,000 key informants. So there's a lot of ways in which we can access communities to deliver risk information in real time to make sure that actions can be taken ahead of what would ultimately become a disaster otherwise. So just re-emphasizing the importance of risk dissemination.
Thank you. Any other question? Yep.
Thank you very much. Yes, I agree with, yes, a very good panel, and thank you for the discussion and the inputs. Just going back a bit on the people on the move and the combination of people on the move and anticipatory action, I think in the three experiences you expressed and hinted at some concrete actions, at some planning and concrete actions, but I would like to know how would you combine this in fragile settings, in contexts where people, yes, are displaced and perhaps are displaced from a long time, but also are likely to be displaced given the context they live in.
Let's take a second question just behind you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Yvonne. I'm here with Schmidt Futures, a philanthropic organization, and I am looking at how to engage the private sector in the world of crisis response and particularly in preparedness. So I'm curious to hear from your perspective, what can the private sector be doing, especially as we think about preparedness impacts everyone, including companies that have operations. So curious to hear any thoughts on private sector involvement. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I ask you to answer, maybe Christelle, if you have anything to add from your own perspective to what was discussed beyond providing the information you gave us, you might come in after the people here on the panel have answered these two questions. Who would like to take the private sector or whatever?
Thank you for letting me in. I've been following very closely. Maybe I can just jump in quickly here on the private sector one, and I'm sure we'll hear more from our co-panelists. We have been working with a few companies indeed that have been collecting data for us, not necessarily to give us a better sense on the scale of disaster displacement, but more frequently to help us understand its impacts on people better. For instance, I remember a few years ago, we worked with Facebook to conduct a short survey in Japan and one in Australia following disaster events, and we were trying to get information directly from affected people. That proved really useful for us. We also collected information from mobile phone providers, that was mentioned already, and other companies. So it's helpful to us. It can come at a high cost, but there are many ways that we can go about it, and there are often also opportunities, for instance, with Facebook, to do this as part of their efforts to help public good initiatives. So that's been a great way forward for us. I think I'll just leave it here and let the other panelists come in. Thank you.
I'll answer both questions, but really quickly. For the first question, so I was encouraged, actually yesterday a colleague shared with me a list of research on modeling and predictive analytics that could contribute to displacement, human mobility, and anticipatory action. So it's an invitation to you to come maybe to our session after this, and there is a working group actually working on anticipatory action in the conflict setting. We also have colleagues who are now working in Central America to look at complex crisis, so anticipatory action and human mobility and extreme weather events. So a lot of exciting projects, collaboration happening at the moment On private sector, there's a lot that private sector could do. We have worked, for example, with insurance company to look at potentially developing insurance or risk financing mechanism. We have worked also with another insurance company to look at basically improving the risk analysis, hazard CAT to improve trigger work. We talk about flood forecasting. Google work with the Red Cross. Again, this is coming to your question on dissemination, on combining basically flood forecasting with digital technology and alerting. So it really depends on what the private sector could bring, but there's a lot of need, and there's also a lot of, let's say, piloting and exploration that the anticipatory action community is doing at the moment.
On the private sector, maybe just to also recognize the fact that after the Ukraine war, there's been I think a significant rise in interest from private sector partners to engage in humanitarian settings. Our organization in particular has had some very interesting engagement with Airbnb, for instance, on provision of temporary shelter for Ukrainian nationals. Amazon has also provided a lot of support through their logistical networks with all of their different arrangements with vendors around the world, which are extremely conducive to providing rapid support to affected persons. And in other settings as well, whether it's around Turkey or Syria, I mean, I think private sector is increasingly more and more interested. Clearly, in terms of traditional donors, there's a lot more interest in trying to diversify the donor base away from ODA and FDI. I think there's a lot of potential around things like bonds, which have not necessarily been explored that much. Some interesting work from Sweden's National Pension Fund on peace bonds, in particular, that might act as new financial mechanisms for things like early warning or anticipation work that could be potentially explored. So I think we're just at the beginning of a discussion with the private sector that needs to continually be reinforced.
Joanna?
Yes, just to add to this, so for the last couple of years, DG ECHO is actually exploring in earnest the issue of engaging with DFIs for innovative financing projects, mainly through blending. And typically, the caseload we're looking at is displaced populations in protracted crisis, so where you know that there is a level of predictability. So we started in 2021 with a round of projects with humanitarian partners in blending instruments. Last year, we engaged with 2 DFIs, again, to try and test what it would look like in terms of bringing in the understanding for the level of acceptable risk, et cetera, et cetera. And this year, again, it's a 3rd round of projects that will come through our Enhanced Response Capacity Program, where, again, what we try to do is now see whether we can actually get the 2 sides together, so the traditional humanitarian partners together with the DFIs, to bring them into this exercise. So a lot of ongoing work on that too. Thank you.
So this was on the private sector, but we had another question too. Your question has not been responded yet.
Maybe also just to say, so there's something called the Center of Excellence for Climate and Disaster Resilience. At COP27 last year on the 7th of November, a new report called Moving Back from the Edge was released, where a series of different UN and Red Cross or Crescent partners put forward basically proposed transformative approaches in fragile, conflict and violent affected settings. From IOM side, we put forward 2 examples. One, a program that we have with the World Bank Group in South Sudan on building climate resilient infrastructure. So eventually every year in South Sudan, the country is affected by regular riverine floods. It's basically an effort to build governance at community level, to empower them to select community projects, including major riverine dikes, to protect communities from regular flood events. The second one is under EU FPI, and there's 2 programs in Somalia right now, in Galmudug and Hirshabelle State, which basically brings together data collection with community stabilization, investments on WASH in particular, and considerations around migration, environment, and climate change. A lot of the data collection is actually around transhumance movements. So because of climate change in places like Somalia and across the Sahel, herding communities are moving at different scales and schedules than usual. And there's much more conflict over water resources in particular. So a part of the project is targeted around conflict mediation, conflict resolution around natural resource management. And that's something that's scaling up in places like Somalia and other places. So I think there are some examples, and I would refer you to this report, which also has examples from the World Food Program, IFRC, FAO, UNDP, and others. So I think there are examples out there that make sense to look at amplification of those approaches, and that really speak to program intervention delivery in conflict-affected settings that have shown a lot of promise.
I realize we are running out of time. Cara, who will moderate the next session, needs a bit of a break, but also to prepare her panel. So instead of making a long, detailed summary, just let me say, for me, there are two messages that come out of this panel. The first message is we really can do something about it. It's a huge challenge here we're facing, but we have so many tools. And the second message is, but we only can use these tools if we are working together across the silos, if we learn from each other, if we start also to coordinate with each other, which is not always easy, as we know, but the potential is really, really very big. With this, I would like to invite Ambassador Anare Levenikila, the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Permanent Mission to the United Nations in Geneva, Permanent Mission of Fiji, to make some closing remarks. Fiji was the previous chair of PDD, and we had a great collaboration. Over to you, Anare.
Thank you, Walter, with your last 2 points. And with what the panelists have shared, you have all taken out the words from my mouth of what I have written as a closing remarks. But firstly, just to thank the panelists and you for very informative and very rich discussions on this important topic. I think in closing, I think one of the most important thing we need to do is just to grow the conversation around the topic that we have. It covers a broad range of areas from early warning to financing to early action. And I think it is important that we continue the discussions to ensure that we continue to build a roadmap on the discussions that we have. We had a small discussion in Suva on the same issue. Now we are here in Brussels, and it's very important that we continue. As we said, there's limited financing that is available, and what actions we can do as states to show political will to address some of the challenges that we had is very important in moving together in terms of building resilience, not only for us, but also for the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Anare. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to everyone.